We'll move on to our next session. It's a panel discussion with Emma Bedford. If I could ask Emma to come to the front. Titled Drawing for Other Faces, Erasure and Animation in William Kentridge Works. We'll have her joined by Ashraf Jamal and Jane Taylor. Emma Bedford is currently a director and senior art specialist at Aspire Art Auctions. Bedford was previously senior art specialist at Strauss & Co., senior curator of contemporary paintings and sculpture, and the head of art collections at Iziko South African National Gallery, and director of Goodman Gallery Cape Town from 2007 to 2009. In 25 years at the National Gallery, she curated exhibitions by artists that included J.H. Pierneef, Irma Stern, Maggie Loubser, and Walter Battis, amongst others. She worked closely with contemporary artists on solo exhibitions such as William Kentridge and Marlene Dumas, Intimate Relations, which traveled to the Standard Bank Gallery, Johannesburg. Both were the first large-scale survey exhibitions in South Africa by Kentridge and Dumas. Bedford curated Fresh, a series of residencies and monographs for young South African artists, which include Senzeni Marasela, Bernie Searle, Robin Rode, Tracy Rose, Usha Seedrum, Dorothy Krutzfeld, and Moshekwa Langa. I'd like to welcome Emma, Ashraf, and Jane to the stage, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Tammy, for that introduction. It's a pleasure to be here today. I want to thank especially Koyo Koyo and Azu Nwagbogu for initiating this very exciting exhibition and the symposium. I'm also deeply grateful to William Kentridge and to his studio for making the extraordinary exhibition possible for us to enjoy. We're going to focus today on drawing for other faces, erasure and animation in the works of William Kentridge. And I'm struck by it following this performance piece in which there was a reference to nature's unforgiving erasure. But before we look more closely at the film, which we will screen first, I just want to say a few words. It's interesting to me that Other Faces has been put at the beginning of the program, given that it is one of the most recent films that form part of the Soho Chronicles. It's in fact the 10th film. It was made in 2011, 22 years after Johannesburg, second greatest city after Paris, which was made in 1989, and 8 years after the last film, which was the 9th film, Tide Table, which was made in 2003. So it represents a considerable shift in time, not just in the political terrain, but also in the artist's subject and approach. As Matthew Kentridge has observed in the Soho Chronicles, the nature of our relationship to the other pervades these 10 films. Kentridge has always been interested in questions of identity, who we are, who we could have been, and how we came to be who we are, and the claims of obligation, what we owe to the world, to specific individuals, and to ourselves. He has explored these themes at a personal level, using Felix and Soho as alter egos, literally the other I, the self, and other in one, and through the way in which his characters, Soho in particular, relate to and interact with the wider world. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with two luminaries of the local and indeed the international art and intellectual sphere. Both have contributed substantially to the ways in which we understand the contemporary world. I'd like to just read through their biographies so that you have a sense of who they are, though I'm sure you're very familiar with them. Jane Taylor is a South African writer, playwright, and academic. She's the author of Being Led by the Nose, William Kentridge, and has written the play text for Ubu and the Truth Commission and the Confessions of Zeno, both plays directed by Kentridge. She's also curated season 4 at the Center for the Less Good Idea, Kentridge's Arts Lab in Maboneng, Johannesburg. She currently holds the Andrew W. Mellon Chair of Aesthetic Theory and Material Performance at the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape. She's the director, in addition to the Laboratory of Kinetic Objects, a center for theoretical and material exploration of the subject-object continuum. She has an extensive bio which continues, and I will give you time to read that if you would like to. But let me also introduce you to Ashraf Jamal. Ooh, let me find the page. Ashraf Jamal is a cultural analyst who has taught in the fields of world literature, post-coloniality, media studies, and visual culture at the University of the Western Cape, at CPUT, at Stellenbosch, Natal, Rhodes, Malaya, and the Eastern Mediterranean in northern Cyprus. Jamal's forthcoming book is titled What We Talk About When We Talk About Art. He's also the author of In the World, Essays on Contemporary South African Art, and Predicaments of Culture in South Africa. The co-author of Art in South Africa, The Future Present, co-author with Sue Williamson, and the co-editor of Indian Ocean Studies, Social, Cultural, and Political Perspectives. For me, it's been a privilege to have been able to work closely with both of our speakers today. Jane Taylor served on the board of the National Gallery for several years and helped shape our collecting and exhibition policies and programs. And Ashraf Jamal was one of the contributors to our publication, The Decade of Democracy, which looked at the collection of the National Gallery collected in that decade and what those works said about and commented on, how they commented on our culture in that period. We're going to begin with a screening of the film Other Faces before we go into our discussion. Thank you. We thought it was important to start with the screening of the film. It's probably one of William's lesser known films, one with which we're less familiar, and that we know the earlier films, having seen them several times. We would like to start, Jane, I think you've put together a set of slides that you of key images that you would take us through.
Okay, thank you so much, Emma, and thanks to the conversation I anticipate with both of you and with you as well. And I haven't so much put together a set of slides. I've got here a cluster of slides because I thought I would like to have visual keys on hand in case questions arise about the techniques and the methods and the meanings. And we'll draw on the slides and we'll draw on William. And we hope that some things that are disclosed here will be surprises to him as well as to us. Some of the information I'm going to communicate with you this morning will be commonplace to some of you, but I think it's instructive to think about the modes in which William works in order to understand the kind of the ethics and the aesthetics, the relationship between the big question of the work of the artist and the big question about the work of the world and how those relate to each other. So I'm very happy to be in so explicit a dialogue with Caroline here as well, and also to be thinking about the palimpsest that was invoked in Temba's play earlier this morning. I'm going to start, though, just with a very brief fragment, and it's a Jewish joke from the best Jewish joker, a fragment from Freud, Reflections on War and Death, and he cites the affectionate husband who says to his wife, "If one of us dies, I shall move to Paris." And what's so marvelous about that is what's invoked in there is our conscience, therefore, does not believe in its own death. So part of what we're engaging in the meditation here is observing someone else, losing neurological capacity, losing their kind of mental apparatus in the world, and in some very complex way thinking about how that relates to the world in which that being, the observer, is participating. And just one more comment within that suite of little comments is the marvelous epitaph from Duchamp's grave, which is, "Anyway, it's always the other guy who dies." So it's that kind of anxious and acrimonious participant observer that the artist is, and that we all are as subjects in the world, in a relationship of ambiguous incredulity in the face of catastrophe. What is so interesting for me in this is that it's never clear in watching the film whether this is a film about the family romance, the sort of classic Freudian relation between father and son and child, or whether this is a film about the streets of Johannesburg so is this Other Faces a film about the formation of the self inside that kind of nuclear matrix where a subjecthood, a personhood is precipitated through a kind of triangulation of different desires and anticipations? Or is this other face of the title the face of that other subject, the other citizen, the one who has a relation to you in the city, a kind of demand, and calls up an obligation and actually precipitates your being by setting up a dialogue with you? And what I think is so compelling about this film is that it holds that ambiguity from beginning to end. Is this a film about one's relations to persons in the world, or is this a film about how we become constituted as human beings in that triangular or dyadic relation, which is the intimacy of the precipitation of personhood? And so in order to think about that complexity, it's interesting then to understand how this in some ways reinforces and arises from William's actual aesthetic method. So if you can think about him as a filmmaker, he'll have an image that will drive an inquiry or an idea. And it's, in some ways, these things arise distinctly, like the scenes of downtown Johannesburg with the Addis Ababa, or with a flyer that he sees on a wall somewhere, forgiveness to all or healing to all in global. Some kind of triggering scene precipitates a germ which will follow along its own trajectory and path. And then at another point, another kind of kernel idea, some kind of instigating thought will prompt itself, whether it is, in this instance, William's observation of his mother in a really critical neurological decline. And somehow these things begin to agitate, to inform one another, to infect one another, so that at some level, the one event becomes a metaphor for the other event. But it's never clear, I think, inside William's sensibility. Perhaps it becomes clearer as the film emerges, but there's always the film is always about this kind of relation. And that also makes me think about a recent paper published by Homi Bhabha, writing about William's work, in which he talks about the critical theoretical significance of the term whilst in William's work. Something is happening whilst something else is happening. And of course, our narcissism precipitates us into the center of the universe, and there's always a kind of an imperative, a demand, and a call from an elsewhere that is simultaneous with whatever it is that is going on inside of us, and we know that, that is the center of the universe. But what Homi Bhabha is drawing attention to is the way that Kentridge's work makes us understand that kind of the key dialogue between multiple, innumerable centers of the universe, and for Caroline, it's even the asteroid. So he will start a series of drawings, and here I'm going to taunt the gods and see what we can do. So there is this, the film opens with this scene of these little kind of Monopoly characters careering towards one another and colliding with one another. Sorry, let me stay there. And he'll use his skills as animator to create a sequence out of this key drawing. So he will, and he characterizes himself primarily as an artist of locomotion, because he'll draw a little fragment, walk away from it, film it for a couple of seconds, go back to the fragment, erase somewhere, supplement somewhere else, go back another 15 paces, film for a couple of seconds, go back to the drawing, erase, supplement. And so the film gets built up across a sequence, an arc of motion, which is the illusion that is created across this one kind of spiral inside the film. And that same process will be will be generated across a series of drawings. So at the end of an incredibly arduous and painstaking process of supplementation and erasure, Kentridge will end up with, a dozen or 20 drawings, because all of the other drawings that go into the making of the animation have been erased in the suite of production and consumption. I think part of why Kentridge's work has such an incredible emotional demand on us, even when we don't understand what's going on, there's a kind of a complexity, one is confounded in the face of a lot of the films. But I think that they all see persistent inside the work of loss and the work of reparation. One is always observing a hand that is doing restoration work and repair, while one is aware of a hand that is obliterating the scene that one's looking at. So I'm just going to scroll through a couple of images. So similarly, these scenes, the scenes of the inner landscape of Johannesburg, would be worked upon, and a sequence of drawings would resolve themselves down in the end to one or two drawings. And because of this complex dynamic between the head, the mind that we are seeing imploding at the same time as we are watching Johannesburg. When I wrote about Other Faces some while ago, I called it inner cities, because it's that sense of the city inside the personhood and the city inside which one lives. And it's not entirely accurate to say that in the film, the city scene and the street map is a metaphor for mind, because we understand always that the street map is a metaphor for the street. So one's constantly in this perpetual pursuit of different orders of metaphoric relation. One of the other aspects of the film that I'm particularly interested in, and something for us to be attentive to as one sees the film, and the films are available downstairs for anyone who feels the obligation to go and see it 15 times to try and understand exactly how the film is constructed, is to work out the eye and the hand relation in Kentridge as he's trying to press as far as possible what he can compel his audience to understand as a meaningful mark. This image of the bird in flight means something in relation to the sequence of the birds in flight, but he has totally obliterated that bird and rubbed its wings into shards of itself And what is so intriguing for him as an observer of observation is how a mark retains its hold on us and how we constitute meaning across an arc of time and an arc of drawings. So you'll see these, you know, and there's a suite of these drawings in the exhibition on the wall, and it's really remarkable to go to that image and say to yourself, how dare you say to me that I'm supposed to see a bird in flight when I see this image? And it's part of the mastery, the exhilaration, I think, of watching the Kentridge is to look at these as singular drawings and also to see them as sequences, because it's through the sequencing with the supplementation of time that these drawings take on their significance and meaning. I'm going to scroll through rather quick, and that as a drawing of a bird, you know, that's kind of outrageous. There is also a very meaningful and tender series of images of the mother and child and also the mind disintegrating. So there are here, we see traces holding on across the mental landscape. Sorry, downtown Johannesburg. We'll come back to that now. It's all a bit, this is a way of rekindling the film for you. So there is the sequences in which one is observing a mind in disintegration, one assumes. I mean, all of these are assumptions and interpretive impositions that we make when we look at the film. These marks which somehow carry emotional meaning. And what's so surprising to us is to understand how little information is there, yet it carries a massive surfeit of affect. And there is a kind of obligation that we read of the artist. That which is not drawn is one of the observations which gets lodged in the middle of the film. And one has the sense here of a kind of a moral obligation of the child as observer, recognizing that that which is not drawn ceases to exist. So there's a kind of, when we see this, the scale of the exhibition here, we feel the compulsion to document every affective charge, every moment witnessed, every person seen. That which is not drawn has no archive of itself. So that's also something that I think is particularly compelling about this work, as we see, like old degraded film, these traces of a memory palace of a family constituted in Johannesburg emerging and disappearing. Extraordinary, the audacity of the out-of-focus image as something that is held and meaningful. And what's marvelous in this is the shift in perspective. If you look at the bed, the board at the foot of the bed or the head of the bed, how that gets displaced as the child refocuses itself, the viewing plane of the child in relation to the mother and in relation to its situation. So now I'm just very quickly, because I don't want to take up much more time, just going to very quickly go back to those scenes of downtown Johannesburg, and this is all thoughtful for you to kind of get flashes of the film again. That confrontation that happens on the side street, that's something that's of real interest to me, precisely because it's so instructive about the ways in which Kentridge observes himself working. In many ways, you know, he returns to the scene of the crime over and over again. What have I done here? What should I be doing other? And so many of the key situations, like this confrontation between these two men in downtown Johannesburg, invoke all of the kind of anxieties about possession, dispossession. A lot of the images are made on bank checks and so on from the mining industry. Both of the businessmen here in their pinstriped suits. So the kind of globalization of capital is part of what one is seeing here. But I just want to remind you that you should go, when you're looking at other faces, glance again at the that which has already come, the scene of the aerial bombardment of Abyssinia, and quite clearly the dialogue between these images reminds us that Kentridge is looking at the long arc of colonialism, That's an event in the middle of the 20th century. And this is a scene from that film, the anamorphic film, in which these two figures find themselves dispersed into a field of weird, slurried marks made on the page, which, when viewed on the reflecting surface of the shiny column, suddenly distill themselves, and they distill themselves so powerfully into ethnic types, the Jew and the black man. And if you look at the image, the drawing in which constitutes those two types, figures of kind of assaulted history, if you look at the mark that is being made, the mark carries no trace of ethnicity. It carries no signifier of the despised one in world history. And suddenly, with a viewing plane, they get reconstituted and become subjects of ideological scrutiny. So I'm now going to hand over to Ashraf, who can help us think further about these other faces. Or I can flick forward through to images if there's any image in particular you'd like us to gaze on.
Firstly, hello to everybody. I presume this was going to be more of a conversation, but I will give some of my thoughts and hopefully create a more prompt dialogue. In terms of what has been said so far about the links between the inner and outer worlds, where does the city live? Which part of the city occupies us? I was struck by something that Lindsay Bremner, the professor of architecture, in a book, Writing the City into Being. And as we're sitting here, I'm looking at Cape Town and its skyline. I'm thinking about Johannesburg and how markedly different it is. And this is what Lindsay Bremner has to say about Johannesburg. Johannesburg is an extremely difficult city to live in, but an addictive city to work on. It never reveals itself at once. In fact, it is reluctant to reveal itself at all. One suspects there must be more to it, more than this shimmering mirage and ceaseless activity, this dross floating on layers of mined-out conglomerate, being endlessly abandoned, reclaimed, recycled, and reused. It is this sense of there being more, not as erasure, secret or underlying logic, but rather as excess, that makes the city so compelling. Now, thinking about her interpretation of Johannesburg, I'm thinking about Kentridge's. I see some strong parodies. The idea of layers of mined-out conglomerate. The mined-out conglomerate is not only geographic or urban. The mined-out conglomerate is also psychological. Because the key thing here, there's a fold between inner and outer worlds, between private and public. It's impossible to create a clean distinction between these worlds. In fact, the important imperative in understanding Kentridge's work is the refusal of binarity in any direct and categorical sense. Yes, there are conflicts and oppositions. For example, the white and black man in a space of collision. But to conceive this merely as a counterpoint in a sort of binary fashion, it's to miss the key issue. The issue is this, that the idea of a race-fixated consciousness that sees people as opposed categories comes in the way of the complexity of two human beings ground down and defined by their color and their history, but who are also more than that limit. So the stress lies in this surplus, the fact that you are not reducible to whom society thinks you are. So the conflict might look like a political conflict, a race conflict between two colors, two men, but something else is going on, because the idea, in terms of Kentridge's broader notion of history and empire, has got a lot to do with the fact he speaks, for example, himself about having a concerned and distanced relationship with the political. This idea of being concerned and distanced is important because I think far too often we overly believe that we must be accountable to the history that has made and shaped us. We are not accountable for it. We are implicated in it. And being implicated in it, how do we then answer to it and for it and in spite of it? And this is the crucial issue about the political arenas that Kentridge's work occupies. For example, he has spoken about the idea that there's a fold between empire and sort of indigenous histories. Again, they're not mutually exclusive. We cannot think of one without the other. We cannot think of an essential Africanity. We have to conceive it as a hybrid history that spans more than 500 years. So that hybridity, that mix, that remix is built into Lindsay Bremner's conception of Johannesburg, but it's also very much built into the way in which Kentridge conceives of his aesthetic and his mode of expression. Now, the key thing about Erasure is not only a technical, conceptual way of approaching art, it's actually an existential manifestation of an impossibility. The impossibility of being as a nominative condition, and the realization that we exist always as verbs, as conditions of becoming, and are therefore always in what Kentridge calls states of transition. But these transitional states can be seen, for example, as effete and cute, if you don't understand that transition is actually a pathology, not only a creative force. It's basically the shackle we are bound to, but also that which incites us to be more than ourselves. So the key thing then, we are caught between pessimism and hope. We're caught between this key stress. To what extent are we overdetermined by our histories? To what extent can we make more of our histories? To what extent can we overcome them? So this idea of some global healing idea, this notion is not simply about some naive belief in global unity or Gilroy's idea of planetary humanism. It is built into that, but it's about something far more fundamental. What makes us human? Even in an inhuman society like ours, how can we become human? The role of art is to do that, to get back to the earlier argument that the job of art is to actually make us realize the importance of our humanity. In that sense, yes, this is how Kentridge's work has actually worked. But just a few very brief formulations from him, which I find very important, which will help us to understand the nature of erasure from a creative and existential point of view. He says, for example, that vulnerability and the process of growth are continuous acts of transition. The key thing here, this is what we need to understand, because we're living in a time where categorical imperatives are rife, where hatred is rife, where division is rife, where we are constructing people as opposed conditions and not understanding the fact that we are in something much more complex, a complex fold of becoming better human beings. And I think it's this core impulse which drives the aesthetic. But it drives the aesthetic from a position of deep subjectivity. Because even though, for example, one might examine and consider the idea of the interfamilial history, the idea of Jewishness, the idea of being a citizen of Johannesburg, and the dilemmas of that, these issues are merely, I would say, sort of triggers within a bigger issue. Why, for example, would Kentridge's art have a global appeal? It would have a global appeal because he is not defined by a region or by continent, but by something far greater, a preoccupation with how erasure impacts all our lives and how all our lives are inescapably held in that space. We are not, remember there's a thing about the indictment of enlightenment earlier on, because that's the core thing. The fight against the Enlightenment is manifested implicitly in the work that Kentridge actually makes. And he makes it because what he wants is imperfection. What he wants us to understand, that we are not these perfected beings. Imperfection of the erasure is a critical idea, not because it's a flaw, but because imperfection is the constitutive dimension of who and what we are as human beings. I'm going to stop there so we can continue and develop the conversation.
Okay, so the question of imperfection, I think, is an extremely interesting and provocative one to think with. And I also want to draw into the conversation Kentridge's work inside other idioms, you know, his work in theater practice and so on. So part of what is foundational to the meaning of the work is this being inside process. I mean, I don't know if either of you want to talk about that, because if one observes the work in its emergence, there is no, you know, something that he articulates quite expressly is there is no master plan at the start of a project. He is in a process of observing something in its emergence and capturing that. What he can do brilliantly is recognize what he is seeing. And for those of you who are interested in following this further, there's a really marvelous series of his Norton lectures at Yale University, in which he talks about these processes of how the eye knows what it's looking at, even if the mind doesn't know how to make it. So if you tear a scrap of paper and fold it, you can suddenly see when it looks like a horse, and you pin that down and you've got a horse. So there's all sorts of kind of exhilaration about this the imperfectibility of the mark, but knowing that the eye will make meaning?
The thing is it's the pleasure, in fact, the jouissance, the bliss that comes out of experimentation. That is what is so intoxicating and addictive about the work. I don't know how many of you have actually sat down and gone through the exhibition. I spent a long time actually looking at the documentary on the making of The Head and the Load, which I found particularly intriguing in terms of what you're saying, because we're trying to get into the links between filmmaking. Because, I mean, I think of Kentridge as a dramaturg, first and foremost, as the kind of defining energy that makes and informs whom and what he is. And that becomes very evident. And there were earlier mentions about how he moves into the realm of shadows. And you talked about process, how process meets the processional. It's a strange issue in the work, because the processional is a defining sort of motif for how people move and carry themselves through the world. But the processional is actually also a figure for process, how we actually, we learn through walking, through growing, through movement. And there are many, many philosophers who have actually engaged in that idea of narrating ourselves in movement rather than in situ, which is the key difference. In situ, one thinks of Rodin's The Thinker. But the world that Kentridge gives us is a world that is highly animated. It's about animus. Okay, so it's all about energy, volatility. And actually, if you think about, and I was talking to my friend Catherine when we were looking at a film the other day, a Kentridge film, and we said, this is the way the brain actually operates. And you mentioned the Norton lectures. Well, I mean, one of the things which, actually, it was Sean O'Toole in his excellent essay, he refers to the Norton lectures, and this is one particular idea. He quotes Kentridge as follows: argument and logic became something on the top of the world, hovering over the surface rather than embedded in this. And it's that embeddedness rather than that synoptic, totalizing, controlling vision of meaning, which is what actually, again, is a distinctive register of how he communicates not only his thoughts, but his feelings, how he constructs his images, be they still. But the still images, for me, are part of a scenography. I always feel them as part of something greater. I always want everything to animate itself. Because it's when it's animated, whether in theater or in film, that I think the work becomes most potent. Because it seems to me they're all part of a series of repetitions, but repetitions in a system that are always different. This is the key thing. And it was Koya and I, in fact, who were talking a few weeks ago. And I said, why is it? Why is it, for example, in this toxic, dull, and Stalinist era in which we're living in, where universes become spaces of idiocy, where basically what's occurred is that they will damn Jacques Derrida for his philosophy of erasure, but they will celebrate Kentridge for his usage of it. And Koya said something very interesting. Well, the difference is that Kentridge is an artist and Derrida is a thinker. Well, I think it's a sweet response, but the key thing is it shows a total bipolarity in the world, where we can enjoy the idea of erasure as an aesthetic medium, but we cannot inhabit it as a space for thinking. Now, the thing is, you must, especially in a sensate and alive thinking culture, rather than one that is actually mired in dogma. I see Pramesh nodding, so I better, in agreement, I think, but I should pause there for now.
Okay, so I think this idea of the relation between the theatrical practice and all of the other practices, part of what one becomes aware of increasingly as you observe the different modes, is that, say, a suite of drawings is actually a kind of residue of something that has happened in an elsewhere. And again, we get back to this question of a whilst. So even inside the work itself, there is a body of work that is precipitating a parallel body of work. And when I was working on the production around the nose, it gave rise to bronzes, it gave rise to films, it gave rise to print works, and so on. So part of what one is observing is that kind of almost a scattershot. He will generate something, try and apprehend what it means by pushing it in one direction. Here I have something that might become a three-dimensional form, and then he pushes it into that three-dimensional form and allows the materiality of the practice to determine whether the image goes or where the form resides ultimately.
Do you want to come in?
The point between 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions is a very, very crucial point because actually he exists in both spaces and exists between them. The key thing is that the act of drawing and the act of sculpture, which is actually, I've been working on this in the context of Deborah Bell, in terms of how she learned to sculpt. She learned to sculpt through printmaking, because printmaking is the point where sculpture and drawing meet. So I think what's happening in terms of the creative energies, and of course Deborah Bell and Kentridge have worked together with Hodgins, I think what occurs is that there is, even in a volumetric work, it's the illustrative two-dimensionality of it that seems to hit us. We're not caught up in the fascination with volume. What we're caught up in is the idea of volume as flux. That's why the idea of things always moving and changing their shape and altering, because it's about matter which actually will not stay still. So even the theatrical work, like the films, is about matter that will not stay still, matter that is interrupted. I mean, when Kentridge speaks about the head and the load trying to create that space, the key thing about it is how non-intelligibility, or what he used, the importance of being stupid, is central to the actual condition of thinking itself. This is actually an argument which Michel Foucault has also made. But the key thing about this is that we tend to want things to have an arc. We want them to have a beginning, middle, and an end. We want to have characters that are resolved, that have actually well-determined personalities and motivations. But the thing is, none of these things have any pertinence in the understanding of what Kentridge is actually doing. He's actually trying to say that every major sort of paradigm, which one has inherited, say, since the 18th century, the paradigm of reason, the paradigm of self-consciousness, Kant's notion of know thyself, all these things are conceived as vanities, which is why, for example, he would err on the side of Goethe rather than the side of Kant, because he's interested in the fact that we actually operate in the world. It's being in the world that makes us whom we are. We do not sit and reflect upon it from a distance and then know it at a distance. So that sense of immanence is there in terms of his philosophical inheritance, and I would say it doesn't only come through Goethe, it comes through Derrida, and it comes through Deleuze. But there's also the aesthetic inheritance, which of course in South Africa is Dumile-Fani, but in terms of European aesthetics, there's Daumier, my favorite, Hogarth. There are many others in terms of key aesthetic influences and shapes. And why Hogarth? Because Hogarth also has a Rabelaisian energy. This is not an artist who is stentorian and patrician in terms of how he manages and discourses upon the world. He is caught in the rub and the mess and the grinds and the farts of living. That's precisely why Hogarth is such a wonderful example of an artist. He doesn't have the grand romanticism of a figure whom I love, Delacroix, because he's very much somebody's caught in matter, in the everydayness of things. So there's no grand transcendental vision. There's no but there's no dark existential Bechettian vision. It's rather something rooted on terra firma that's implicated in history, but it's also implicated in the raw data of everyday and ordinary life.
So also to go back to this question about the constitution of the self as a coherent being, part of what one understands through the process of work that we observe in Kentridge is that because there is no kind of grand narrative of who one is becoming, the sort of unfolding of the self is always at some level some kind of happy accident. There's a kind of pathology inside the human subject which always has to recuperate previous event as if one was moving towards some kind of preordained fulfillment of the self, a realization of the self as one's best being. And and every time one writes a CV, one understands that all of the kind of deviations that you made, which are just kind of aberrations in one's life path, from a perspective looking back across the arc of one's life, one has to recuperate all of those kind of critical crises in which one stumbles and is diverted into an elsewhere, which then become part of a narrative of a grand self that was always actualizing in a process in this sort of Kantian way. So I think that's also something that's somehow implicit in a filmmaker who is, after all, erasing all of those traces the whole time. Very difficult to hold onto this construction of the self without having to go back and reconstitute it through another physical act of drawing. And every time he draws, of course, what's marvelous is one understands the second drawing will not be the same as the first. And it's quite interesting, there are a number of exercises that he's engaged in where he's made a kind of an accidental drawing, and then, you know, he'll find himself drawing a vase or a scene, and that accidental drawing will please him so much that he feels he has to make it part of another body of work, and so he'll draw a better version of that accidental drawing, and the better version is always unsatisfying. It's always somehow too well-mannered. It's got its teeth clean. So there's something about the rough accident of finding the event that is pleasing to the hand and pleasing to the eye and mind in Kentridge's sense of this kind of emerging playfulness of the mayhem.
I can't remember the correct phrase by Kentridge, but it's something to do with being beware of revision. And that's what Jane is actually picking up on as well. But the interesting thing is the precision, because there is precision, it lies in imprecision. That's how one arrives at the precise moment, the precise mark, in and through the imprecise. And there is a particular formulation by Deleuze, my particular favorite French philosopher, and he basically says the following: inexactitude is the exact path of something that is done and not an approximation. The idea here is that the imprecision in the action of making is what everything is all about, whereas approximation is a mimetic conceit, a belief, a metaphoric conceit, you know, because metaphor is the equating of the unequal. It can never be what it purports to be. There's always going to be a lacuna. There's always going to be a gap. There's always going to be a point when things do not match. So I feel sorry for people who get married hoping that they're going to find life partners, because that's an impossible exercise. Because it doesn't exist in life, it doesn't exist in art. But what does exist is this repetition that exists through difference. Difference is the beautiful thing which all those maligned French philosophers have celebrated, which now, in our stunted Stalinist moment, we hate. Because we're now all about absolutes and imperatives and racial and gender-based objectives and other forms of idiocy. But the real great thinkers are the ones that actually understand the greater complexity of life. And in this regard, the following formulation, which I read at 4 o'clock this morning in a book by Grayling on the history of philosophy, and the section on Deleuze. And this is the line I took out because it made me think of what we were going to be doing today. And it's got to do with the fact that difference inhabits repetition, okay? And this is a Nietzschean concept, the eternal recurrence, which, of course, Deleuze picks up on. And the following formulation by Grayling is as follows: the subject of the eternal return is not the same, but the different, not the similar, but the dissimilar. So, for example, the idea of return is not a return to some point of comfort, some preordained idea of whom you are, but this return integrates what Kentridge would call breathing and dissolving. Without breath, without dissolution, there is no return. And what you return to is not the self you knew, but the self you must become. So the key thing about time, which sadly we've made a grotesque error of because we've seen it causally as beginning, middle, and end, is that we have not understood the importance of recurrence as the defining category of whom we are. T.S. Eliot did so beautifully, admittedly, unfortunately, through a Catholic paradigm. But if you read his great poems about, you know, the idea of circularity, returning to whom you are, the idea is not to return to some perfectible original moment, but to return to the hiccup which shapes our lives at every point, before birth and after death, and in the middle, in the intermediary, which defines whom we are. And I think this has been the great insight and the most useful insight which Kentridge's aesthetic has provided.
I think we should open it to the audience.
Exactly. Are there any questions or comments? Storm?
Thank you. Just standing a bit to the side. I'm going to gingerly disagree with Ashraf a little bit. And just your point about that the work is not about binaries. In this particular work, I think maybe there is a very particular binary that kind of, through a very particular narrative progression, leads to a collision between two people. The one is a white man and the other one is a black man. And it kind of ends with a kind of a slide that says, "You fucking white man." So, I mean, that is an aspect of the film that we cannot ignore, but that it does talk to a very particular kind of binary. And not to say that other works of William kind of, are against these binaries or where things kind of dissolve a little bit, but I just want to maybe delve a little bit deeper into this particular moment in the film. But also he sets it within kind of other vignettes or leads up that are almost flashbacks or kind of have other kind of narrative structures. So maybe if we can just speak about that a little bit.
Very briefly, that collision, which you conceive as a binary collision, occurs on a street called Error. So one has to understand that the binary which we are foregrounding, which the artist is foregrounding, is a binary that is constructed for our reflection, but we are not reducible to that construction because we must remember the road upon which it's happening. An error, which is the idea where mistakes occur. So the mistake could also be the conflict between people who perceive themselves as racially different, rather than people who fetishize racial difference. So yes, we are seeing this because this is the limit text in which we're living, a space of racial collision. But that racial collision is happening inside a space that is intrinsically error-based or erroneous. The implicit assumption being here, it is erroneous to conceive of life in such a didactic and conflicted way. Otherwise, why would he put the notion of the idea of global healing as central to his work? So I'm saying, yes, there's a tension between, but to fixate that on that at the expense of something far more important is to miss the point. But then we are missing the point horribly in our redundant and stupefyingly banal debate on racism, which defines our society, this sad moment in history.
You want to respond?
I'm good, thanks.
Any other comments or thoughts? Anyone want to engage in the fray?
Yes. My name is Saki Gcina. I'm part of the curatorial team at Zeitz Mocaa. And I wanted to speak about the use of language in the film. I'm a Xhosa speaking person, and it was interesting to hear how a certain phrase that was repeated started to be used onomatopoeically, but also transitioned into almost a musical composition in opera. But this statement that was repeated is Sundi Qhela, which means many things, but it is used when you're trying to refute an insult or when you threaten a person to not violate or harm you. And it's interesting how he decided to use Xhosa as a form of oral narration tool. And I just wanted to perhaps find out if you can expand about this use of sound.
Thank you, Saki Gcina, for that observation and for explaining the meaning of that word. Yes, I think it speaks very directly to what you're saying, that, that he wants us to think about race in different terms.
Yes, what was it? No, I heard him saying something about not to harm.
Yes, it's a tool when you're trying to warn a person to not violate you. So you're saying, don't you dare.
Don't you dare.
Yes.
Don't you dare. Or,
So translation is a slippery beast.
Yes, yes.
I do know that William works very closely with Philip Miller, who was the composer on this work, and there's a whole range of incidental sound as well as scripted music. So there's found sound and there is composed sound. There are a range of different oral textures here. One thinks also of Caliban in The Tempest, who talks about the sounds of his island, that sense of someone who has a kind of an indigenous oral universe, who lives inside a sound world that is owned by them and owns them. It also blurs in a way with the kind of slight clickings and moans and murmurs that the mother makes. So there's an incredibly complex and interesting field of sound. So there's no one dimension. And I think, again, it's that sense of a very profound complexity that is worked across the composed, the found, and the pre-recorded derived natural sounds. So I think, I do remember some while ago being instructively told with Kentridge working on a sequence in which a rather poor drawing, and I say that affectionately because that was his comment, of someone kicking someone lying on the street, and he said, don't you see the leg really looks like a lamb chop? No, nobody would possibly understand if they saw this as a drawing of a leg, but it's when that leg strikes the figure on the ground and there's a chop sound of the flesh upon flesh, and that's what anchors the drawing in one's mind. And I think as the work has evolved over the years, that incredible profundity and complexity of the dialogue between ear, eye, and mind, that what one is hearing is what one is seeing. And that's a really, really striking thing. Because we live in such a visual culture, a specular culture, we think that the eye is driving the senses that we are making, but it is a very profoundly oral world, and the sounds that we see determines what we, the sounds that we hear, there's a marvelous slip, the sounds that we see. So the essay in Art Africa is about the shadow that you see, or the sound that you see that may be the shadow that you see may be a sound. So I think this kind of dialogue, the playfulness between the senses, is something that's really constitutive of Kentridge's work.
Yes, just to add to that, the film ends with the kind of negation, I think, of some of the explicit violence in the film, and perhaps racism as well.
But yeah, the thing is, again, in terms of these issues of violence and racism, Kentridge himself has said that violence and grotesquerie make very fine bedfellows. The argument here, the grotesquerie, is the word you need to actually think about. The grotesquerie of violence, the macabre nature, the condition that allows us to perpetuate that. You were talking about the drawing of the man kicking another man, for example. But the thing is, yes, there is that issue. But if one looks at secondhand writing, and he says, there's a line that says, start with the death of Othello and Desdemona. Start with a story that begins after the toxicity of Iago's conspiring against Othello's love for Desdemona, the black body, the black ram, for the white figure. I mean, guys, just grow up. For goodness sake, you're so locked in this tedium, of gender and sexuality and erotics and the illicit and the taboo and the black and the white. It's so unutterably boring. And I believe that drive is there. It overrides these conflicts which Kentridge has to deal with, but something else is working to a greater cause. It's my key argument.
Is there a question from the back?
Yes. If one of you can just elaborate on the sense that you're so aware of the artist, almost as the architect of the story, and you see it quite early on in the path that the bird is taking, almost as if his path is determined. And I'm just wondering if it suggests that the destiny of where the path of the characters, or as a nation where they're going, that the artist is suggesting that it is determined, and there's not a sense of free will that comes with that. Yeah, if you can elaborate on that, thank you.
So, do you want to open that? And I'm going to just look at a sequence toward the end of the film, which is marvelous because of its cyclical nature. We were talking about circles and spirals earlier. It's this extraordinary sequence. This is a photograph, not from the film itself, of the young Kentridge and his mother and his birthday. And that gets structured into the film in this incredibly poignant image of the man taking care of the infant, who is the mother, who is taking care of the man. So that, one is reminded of the riddle of the Sphinx, that we start as a figure on 4 legs, and then we move to 2 legs, and then we go back to 3 legs. That kind of So sorry. Okay, so I was just talking, the previous image is a photograph of the young Kentridge with his mother and a birthday cake, and that you get that sense of the child being nurtured into well-being, and this is part of the dialectic of the relation of the project of the self inside the family and the self inside the city, and that gets transmuted into this extraordinary image of Kentridge holding an infant who is the mother, and himself in turn being held by the mother who is embracing the man as her infant. So that kind of cycle, the infinite return of mother, child, and infant repeating one another is through a kind of, it could almost be a DNA chain. And what one thinks about here is the riddle of the Sphinx. The Sphinx asks classically, what is it that starts on 4 legs and then goes to 2 legs and ends up on 3 legs? And the answer is, of course, man. So this sense of a kind of an infinite regress and infinite return, such as Ashraf was invoking earlier.
Shall we take another question?
Yeah.
Yes. Hello, if we could just stick with this image and referring back to the keynote, the prior keynote speaker, around Ettinger and the matrixial, I'm struck by this image and her more recent writings on carrions. And I was wondering if the panel could talk about that, perhaps.
And her more recent writing on?
Carrions. So she moves from...
Oh.
Okay, yeah.
No, okay, elaborate. She moves from?
Well, within the matrixial, she talks about the idea of carrying and carrions. And what I'm struck by here is the child is carrying the mother, who's carrying the child, who's carrying the mother. And so it's appealing to a way of being in the world whereby she talks about what do we do with trust after the death of trust, and how do we carry each other, how do we carry or bear the pain or the trauma of the other. And I'm quite struck by how this image seems to embody that.
I'm going to start at a slightly oblique angle to this question and then also give Ashraf some time to think about a response and also to engage with us, because I've observed Kentridge directing puppets, and I've worked very closely with Handspring Puppet Company. And the task of that collaborative endeavor is precisely that all of the life forms in that performance idiom are dependent on someone else carrying them. And it's something that Handspring and Kentridge have explored over decades together. What is the kind of mutuality? How is all life on the puppet stage enabled because someone is doing the task of holding on behalf of another? And the astonishing level of regard, attention, and responsibility inside that process, where you know that the moment there is a kind of a faltering inside that space, the entire universe disintegrates. Everyone has to know with a gesture like that that someone is there to pick up that body and to enable it and enliven it once again. So I know that these are not accidental art forms that happen to be alongside one another. These are philosophical and theoretical interrogations where one practice informs the next practice, and these things are in a very substantial dialogue with each other.
Okay, we've been informed that we have, I think, 5 minutes left. Would you like
Just very briefly, I wanted to take your minds back to the Junction Theatre and a brilliant production I saw, I think, in 1992 called Tooth and Nail. I'm bringing this up because I'm bringing up the notion of a Brechtian aesthetic as being central to a specific strain in South African theatre in which Kentridge's work has largely participated. The key difference, though, is that Brecht's concept of epic theatre is ultimately a theatre that is designed to be didactic, is to give over and to pass on a political message. And the key thing in Kentridge's work, while it plays fast and loose with Brechtian aesthetics, actually resists the idea of the final message. It suspends it and allows it to equivocate. Now, this brings me finally to another metaphor of his, which I find even more striking and very pertinent in terms of this idea of how does the past relate to the present, relate to the future? How can we conceive of genealogy? How do we conceive of our history? Which is what this image which Jane has presented before us is all about. Well, for me, it basically tells us that all history exists in one moment, and that moment is impossible to decipher. The moment is the present, which perpetually shifts. Because there is no past and there is no future, except an imagining and construction of these spaces in which one can never inhabit. So the past and the future only exist as traces in an ineluctable present, a present which can never also exist. So where does time exist? Where does memory live? And so just in conclusion, one thing that I found particularly interesting in The Body Drawn and Quartered is when William Kentridge shifts from pentimenti, and we spoke about it early on, to sonar, an X-ray, an MRI, and CAT scan. This image can be seen as a form of sonar, as a form of MRI, as a CAT scan within a visual idiom. Why? This is what Kentridge says: dissect as deep as you like, and you will never find the mimetic reference of the sonar. So, if mimesis is a referential sort of idiom and system, one in which we see people differently in opposed conditions, black, white, man, woman, straight, gay, straight, etc., all these things. This is a mimetic construct, but it's an illusion. Because where do we actually live? We live in sonar. So, they are already a metaphor. So we are always living in spaces of transference. We're always in places of transition. We are never anything, any one thing, ever. Okay? There are messages from the inside we may apprehend but can never grasp. In their separation from the apparent, they come as reports from a distant and an unknown place. And this is where I think the greatest force of Kentridge's work lies, that it's a report from a distant and an unknown place, rather than a story we can easily interpret and negotiate and mediate and pass back and forth like a leg that's badly drawn. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you to both
Emma.
brilliant
Emma.
contributions. Yes? Would you like to...
I'd like to say a couple of things. I know it's an awkward... because it's not my panel, it's not my talk. But there are a lot of things I'd like to thank the panelists for. And a couple of things of clarity, of explanation. I'm delighted that you put me together with Goethe rather than Kant, as philosophical. I've never quite understood Immanuel Kant, and very happy to be with Goethe. I thought only Goethe could have written the lines about meine Ruhe ist hin, mein Herz ist schwer, das find ich nimmer und nimmermehr. And it's him as poet as well as philosopher. So thank you for that. And then in terms of the inexactitude, in our family we had a person who worked for us who had twins. And she called one of her twin sons perfect, and she called the other son excellent. And we had a debate amongst us about, would you rather be perfect or excellent? And my wife and one daughter decided they, of course, wanted to be perfect. The other daughter and I said, no, that's impossible. We would always go for excellent rather than. So I think that also strikes a strong chord. In terms of just a couple of the details of the film, and I think here what you said, Ashraf, is important, that being a report from a moment, that each of the films contains things directly observed, and they're there as kind of markers of that time in Johannesburg. So Erasure Street is a real street in Johannesburg, and the text that was referred to on the screen came directly a report of a bumper-bashing argument. There were two huge Johannesburg SUVs, I think a Land Rover and a huge Toyota, that had touched bumpers, and there were two businessmen, a white businessman and a black businessman, and the line on the screen was what one was shouting at the other non-stop, you fucking white man. And you had a sense in that rage, it was both a rage about a bumper bashing, but it was also a rage of generations of not being heard. So that was marked rather than saying this is a film about that, it's saying this is one of the elements of Johannesburg. The xenophobic attacks was another thing in 2011 that was there as a kind of marker. So it's always a strange mixture of, yes, they do have meanings beyond their origins, but they also do have quite banal or quite specific origins. So I just want to, and I'd like to thank you all on the panel for the attention to the film, for the new things you point out to me. It's always interesting to discover what you've been doing, because it's, as all of you said, it starts from not knowing what the end is going to be. Thank you very much.